The bedroom curtains filtered the morning light, just enough to make Thomas wonder if he was still dreaming. But the digital clock on his nightstand glowed its familiar red numbers, and the coffee maker was already gurgling downstairs on its automatic timer. Everything was exactly as it should be, except for one small detail that would change everything. Thomas had walked past that empty lot every single day for 3 years. Rain or shine, Monday through Friday, his route to the bus stop took him directly past the corner of Maple and 3rd Street. The lot sat there, like a missing tooth in the neighborhood's smile, surrounded by a chain-link fence that had seen better days. Weeds pushed through cracks in the concrete foundation, and someone had spray-painted something illegible on the back corner years ago. He knew that lot better than he knew some of his neighbors. He'd watched it through the seasons, seen snow pile up in the corners, watched puddles form after heavy rains. The city had put up a for sale sign once, but even that had faded and tilted over time. It was just part of the landscape now, as permanent and unremarkable as the fire hydrant or the crooked street sign. But this morning, as Thomas rounded the corner with his usual hurried stride, he stopped so suddenly that his briefcase swung forward and nearly knocked him off balance. Where the empty lot had been, where it had always been, stood a house, not a house under construction, not a house being moved in or assembled, a complete house, as if it had always been there, as if Thomas had somehow been blind to it for 3 years running. The morning light caught the pale yellow siding, and the front porch swing moved slightly in the breeze. There were flowers in the window boxes, their colors bright and fresh. The mailbox by the street had a name painted on it in neat black letters. Thomas blinked hard, the way you do when you think your eyes are playing tricks on you. He rubbed them with the back of his hand, looked away, looked back. The house remained exactly where it shouldn't be. The architectural style was what his mother would have called colonial revival. Nothing fancy but well maintained. 2 stories with white trim around the windows, a red front door that looked like it had been painted recently. The lawn was perfectly manicured, not a single dandelion or brown patch visible. Even the driveway looked freshly sealed, with no oil stains or cracks. Thomas found himself walking closer, drawn by the impossibility of it all. The chain-link fence was gone, of course. In its place was a neat white picket fence with a gate that stood slightly ajar. He could see tire tracks in the gravel driveway, and there were newspapers stacked neatly on the front porch. 2 of them, maybe 3, as if whoever lived here had been away for a few days and just returned. The details were what made it most unsettling. This wasn't some hastily constructed facade or movie set. The house had character, the kind of lived-in details that take years to accumulate. The porch steps showed slight wear patterns where feet had climbed them countless times. One of the shutters hung just slightly askew, the way they do when the hardware gets loose over time. There was a garden hose coiled beside the house, and a small child's bicycle leaned against the garage door. Thomas checked his watch. He was going to be late for work if he didn't move soon, but his feet seemed rooted to the sidewalk. He pulled out his phone and started to dial his office, then stopped. How do you explain this to anyone? How do you call in late because a house appeared overnight where there used to be an empty lot? Instead, he took pictures, lots of them. The house from every angle, the street sign to prove the location, even a selfie of himself standing in front of it, with what he was sure was a bewildered expression. The camera captured everything perfectly, proving that he wasn't hallucinating or having some kind of breakdown. A car drove past, the driver giving him a curious glance, but not stopping. To them, Thomas probably looked like someone taking pictures of a perfectly ordinary house for perfectly ordinary reasons. Maybe he was thinking of buying it, or maybe he was a real estate agent. The driver couldn't know that Thomas was documenting what felt like a glitch in reality itself. The front windows were clean and bright, with curtains that looked recently hung. Thomas could see shapes inside, the suggestion of furniture arranged in rooms that had every appearance of being lived in. A lamp on what looked like a side table, the corner of a sofa, something that might have been a bookshelf. All of it visible but indistinct, like looking at a photograph that was slightly out of focus. He walked around the perimeter, staying on the public sidewalk but examining every detail he could see. The house sat on its lot as if it had been there for decades. The foundation looked properly settled, with no signs of recent construction. The landscaping was mature, with bushes that must have taken years to grow to their current size, and a maple tree in the backyard that was easily 15 feet tall. Thomas had grown up in this neighborhood. He'd played on these streets as a child, had walked past this corner thousands of times over the years. He would have remembered if there had ever been a house here. He would have remembered when it was torn down, if that's what had happened. But his memories of the empty lot were clear and consistent, stretching back as far as he could recall. The mailbox drew his attention again. The name painted on it was Henderson, written in a careful hand that suggested someone had taken time to make it look just right. Below the name was a house number that fit perfectly with the addressing system on the street. Nothing about it seemed wrong or out of place, except for the fact that it existed at all. Thomas found himself wondering about the Hendersons. Were they inside right now, having breakfast, completely unaware that their house had materialized overnight? Or were they part of whatever strange thing was happening here? He almost walked up to the front door, almost knocked to see who would answer, but something held him back, some instinct that warned him he wasn't ready for whatever conversation that might lead to. The morning was getting warmer, and more people were starting to move around the neighborhood. A woman jogged past, her breathing steady and rhythmic. A man in a bathrobe walked to the end of his driveway to collect his newspaper. Normal people doing normal things, as if the world hadn't just shifted slightly on its axis. Thomas realized he was going to have to make a choice. He could pretend he'd never seen this, could take a different route to work and try to convince himself it had been some kind of stress-induced hallucination. Or he could acknowledge what was right in front of him and try to understand it. The house wasn't going anywhere. It sat there patiently, looking like it had been part of the neighborhood forever. The morning light was starting to shift, and Thomas could see more details now. There was a small garden beside the house with tomato plants that looked healthy and well-tended. Wind chimes hung from the front porch, moving gently in the breeze and creating a soft, pleasant sound. Everything about the house suggested normalcy, routine, the kind of comfortable domesticity that develops over years of living in the same place. But Thomas knew with absolute certainty that it hadn't been there yesterday. He'd walked past that empty lot just 24 hours ago, had glanced at it the way he always did, noting the weeds and the faded for sale sign. The implications were staggering. If a house could appear overnight, complete with all the details of years of habitation, then what else was possible? What other aspects of the world that seemed solid and reliable might be subject to sudden, inexplicable change? Thomas took one more picture, this one of the house number on the mailbox. He wanted to be able to find this place again, to verify that it was real and not some elaborate dream. Then he forced himself to start walking toward the bus stop, his mind racing with questions that had no ready answers. The bus ride to work passed in a blur of half-formed thoughts and theories. Thomas stared out the window, seeing the familiar cityscape but unable to focus on any of it. His phone buzzed with notifications, but he ignored them. Nothing in his normal routine seemed important anymore compared to the mystery of the house that wasn't there yesterday. At the office, Thomas tried to go through the motions of his regular day. He answered emails, attended meetings, made phone calls, but his mind kept drifting back to the house on Maple and 3rd Street. During his lunch break, he found himself researching the property online, looking for any record of when it might have been built or who might own it. The city's property database showed the lot as residential, with a house listed at that address. According to the records, it had been built in 1987 and was currently owned by Robert and Sarah Henderson. The property taxes were current, the utilities were connected, and everything appeared to be in perfect order, as if the house had been there all along, as if Thomas's memories of an empty lot were somehow mistaken. But Thomas knew what he'd seen. He'd walked past that empty lot every day for 3 years. He had pictures on his phone from previous months showing the vacant space, the chain-link fence, the weeds growing through the cracked foundation. The evidence was there, stored in digital format, proof that his memories weren't playing tricks on him. The afternoon crawled by with agonizing slowness. Thomas found himself checking the time constantly, eager to get back to the neighborhood and see if the house was still there. Part of him hoped it would be gone, that reality would have reasserted itself and returned things to the way they should be. But another part of him, the part that had always been drawn to mysteries and puzzles, wanted the house to remain exactly where it was. When 5 o'clock finally arrived, Thomas practically ran to catch his bus. The ride home seemed to take forever, every red light and traffic delay adding to his growing sense of anticipation. He'd spent the entire day thinking about the house, imagining scenarios and explanations, but nothing he'd come up with felt adequate to explain what he'd witnessed. The bus dropped him at his usual stop, and Thomas walked quickly toward Maple and 3rd Street. His heart was pounding, though he wasn't sure if it was from excitement or anxiety. As he rounded the corner, he half expected to see the empty lot again, to discover that the morning had been some kind of elaborate hallucination brought on by stress or lack of sleep. But the house was still there. If anything, it looked even more settled and permanent than it had in the morning. The late afternoon light gave the yellow siding a warm glow, and there were more signs of occupancy now. A car sat in the driveway, a sensible sedan that looked like it belonged to people who lived quiet, ordinary lives. The porch light was on, and Thomas could see the flicker of what might have been a television through the front window. Someone was home, the Hendersons, presumably, going about their evening routine in a house that hadn't existed 24 hours ago. Thomas wondered if they had any idea how impossible their situation was, or if they were as much a part of the mystery as the house itself. He stood on the sidewalk for a long time, watching the house and trying to work up the courage to approach it. The smart thing would be to go home, to research the situation more thoroughly, to try to find a rational explanation for what was happening. But Thomas had never been particularly good at taking the smart path when the interesting path was available. The gate in the white picket fence was still slightly ajar, as if inviting him to enter. Thomas took a deep breath and pushed it open, the hinges creaking softly in the evening air. He walked up the path to the front door, his footsteps loud on the brick walkway. The porch swing creaked gently as he passed it, and he could smell the flowers in the window boxes, their fragrance sweet and fresh. Thomas raised his hand to knock on the red front door, then hesitated. What would he say? How do you explain to someone that their house appeared overnight, that it's sitting on a lot that was empty just yesterday? How do you ask someone if they're real, if their entire existence might be part of some cosmic joke or glitch in reality? The door opened before he could knock, as if someone had been watching him approach. A woman stood in the doorway, middle-aged and pleasant-looking, with graying hair and kind eyes. She was wearing a floral apron and holding a dish towel, as if she'd been interrupted in the middle of preparing dinner. She asked, and her voice was exactly what Thomas would have expected from someone who lived in a house like this, warm and welcoming, with just a hint of curiosity about why a stranger was standing on her porch. Thomas opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. How do you begin a conversation like this? How do you explain the impossible to someone who might be impossible themselves? "I'm sorry," he finally managed. I was wondering about your house." The woman smiled, and Thomas could see genuine pride in her expression. "Thank you. We've put a lot of work into it over the years." "Over the years," Thomas repeated, testing the words. "Oh, goodness. It must be going on 15 years now. We bought it when our daughter was in middle school. She's married now, has children of her own." 15 years. Thomas felt dizzy. The woman was talking about 15 years of memories, of life lived in a house that Thomas was certain hadn't existed yesterday. She spoke with the casual authority of someone recounting simple facts, not someone constructing an elaborate fiction. The woman's expression didn't change, but Thomas thought he saw something flicker in her eyes, a moment of uncertainty, perhaps, or recognition. She said slowly, "No, I don't think so. This house has been here for quite a while." There was something in the way she said it that made Thomas think she knew more than she was letting on. But before he could ask another question, she stepped back into the house. "I should get back to dinner," she said. "My husband will be wondering where I've gone." "Thomas." "Nice to meet you, Thomas. I'm Sarah Henderson." The door closed with a soft click, leaving Thomas standing alone on the porch. He could hear movement inside the house, the sound of normal domestic life continuing. Whatever was happening here, the Hendersons seemed to be living it completely, without any apparent awareness that their existence was impossible. Thomas walked back to the gate, his mind spinning with new questions. Sarah Henderson had seemed perfectly real, perfectly normal, but she'd also seemed to know something about his confusion, had almost seemed to be expecting it. The way she'd emphasized the words, "right in front of you," suggested she understood more about the situation than she was willing to admit. The evening was getting darker, and lights were beginning to come on in houses throughout the neighborhood. Thomas could see the warm glow of windows, the comfortable scenes of families settling in for the night. Everything looked normal, peaceful, exactly as it should be in a quiet residential area, except for the house that wasn't there yesterday. Thomas walked home slowly, his mind churning with possibilities. He'd read about things like this, of course. Urban legends and strange stories, tales of places that appeared and disappeared without explanation. But those were always stories that happened to other people, in other places. They weren't supposed to happen on familiar streets, in neighborhoods where you'd lived your entire life. At home, Thomas sat at his computer and began researching everything he could find about the property at Maple and 3rd Street. The deeper he dug, the more confusing it became. Every official record showed the house as having been built in 1987, owned by the Hendersons since 2009. There were permits on file for various home improvements over the years, utility records showing consistent usage, even Google Street View images, that clearly showed the house in its current location. But Thomas also found his own photos from previous months, pictures he'd taken while walking through the neighborhood, clear images of the empty lot, the chain-link fence, the weeds and cracked concrete. The metadata confirmed the dates and locations, proving that his memories weren't fabricated or mistaken. Two sets of evidence, completely contradictory, both apparently authentic. Thomas stared at his computer screen, feeling as if he were looking at proof that reality itself was unreliable, that the world he thought he knew was subject to sudden and inexplicable revision. He made himself a cup of coffee and sat back to think. There had to be an explanation, something that would make sense of what he'd experienced, but every possibility he considered seemed more unlikely than the last. Mass hallucination, elaborate hoax, government conspiracy, parallel dimensions, time travel, divine intervention. None of it sounded remotely plausible when applied to a quiet residential street in a perfectly ordinary city. The coffee grew cold as Thomas sat there, staring at the evidence of impossible things. Outside his window, the neighborhood settled into its evening rhythm, unchanged and unremarkable. But Thomas knew that something fundamental had shifted, that the world was no longer quite what it had seemed to be just 24 hours ago. Tomorrow, he would walk past the house again. He would see if it was still there, if the Hendersons were still living their apparently normal lives in a place that shouldn't exist. And maybe, if he was brave enough, he would try to understand what it all meant, what it said about the nature of reality and the reliability of human perception. But tonight, Thomas simply sat with the mystery, letting it wash over him like a tide that had shifted the familiar shoreline of his world. The house that wasn't there yesterday had appeared, complete with inhabitants who seemed to have always been there. And somehow, in the space between impossible and inevitable, Thomas found himself beginning to accept that maybe the world was far stranger and more wonderful than he'd ever imagined. The evening deepened, and Thomas finally went to bed, though he doubted he would sleep much. His dreams, when they came, were filled with houses that appeared and disappeared like mirages, with streets that rearranged themselves when no one was looking, with the persistent feeling that reality was far more fluid than anyone wanted to admit. And so, as our mysterious visitor closes his eyes one last time in the house that wasn't there yesterday, perhaps he's found the peace that had eluded him for so long, whether the house was real or a dream, a gift or a curse. It served its purpose. Sometimes the things we cannot explain are exactly what we need most. Sleep well, and may your own dreams be filled with the unexpected magic that waits just beyond the edge of understanding.